What is up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Red Chip Poker podcast. The topic of this episode is going to be naming conventions. There's a really strong link between the way we think about poker and the way that we talk about poker. Improving the way that we talk about poker can actually make us stronger poker players because we'll also be thinking about the game on a better level. Now, this might at first seem like a little bit of a far-out concept until you realize that other similar disciplines to poker use similar techniques. For example, if we take an established discipline like chess and we think about the various openings and tactics, many of them have names. When chess players are discussing various openings that can take place, they use the name of that opening. They don't just say things like, hey, you know that situation where white moves his king pawn forward 2, and then black moves his queen pawn forward 2, and then white moves his knight. They actually use the name of that situation. And after doing that, both players involved in the conversation are instantly aware of the situation that's being spoken about, and there's not really a large chance that there's any confusion going on. Now, we don't exactly need to be chess players to know that's the case. For example, if you and another friend are talking about a third friend, we use that friend's name. We don't say things like, hey, you know that guy with the glasses and the yellow hair. Because if we do that, we might end up talking about the same person, or we might end up in a conversation where we both think we're talking about the same person, but we're actually talking about something completely different. So having that name, that handle in place, is the first step when it comes to theorizing about something at a higher level. Poker is absolutely no exception. We should have proper naming conventions for the most common poker situations. And we also want to make sure that we're using the existing range of terminology accurately as well. This can also be a problem. Let's think about an example of that. Let's imagine a situation where a weak naming convention is used. So a player comes to us and asks us the following question: what should we do when facing a re-raise pre-flop? Now, there's nothing technically wrong with that question. It's a valid question in some contexts. It's just really unspecific. It doesn't really give us a lot of information about the actual situation that that player is facing. Let's see if we can improve the accuracy of the names used. How about this one? What should we do when facing a cold 4-bet? Well, we know we're talking about a pre-flop situation now, and we know that it's a very specific type of re-raise. It's not an open raise, it's not a 3-bet, it's not a 5-bet, it's specifically a 4-bet. And we also know that it's a cold 4-bet, which means that the player who is 4-betting didn't take any action so far pre-flop in the current hand. You can see just by tweaking the terminology slightly, we're conveying a much larger amount of information. But we can do even better. How about the following? What should we do when facing a cold 4-bet after opening in early position? So we've actually once again upgraded the accuracy of that question by including more relevant terminology. And it doesn't end there. We can think about other qualifiers such as bet sizing, positions, effective stack, and opponent type. And it's very often that we can quickly determine how good a player is by the accuracy of the questions they ask. So if we're speaking to a beginning Hold'em player, they might ask questions such as, so I was playing this hand the other day, I have ace-king offsuit pre-flop, my opponent goes all in. Should I call in that situation? Once again, we've got some information, but not really enough to make a valid decision. How would a professional player describe that same hand? Well, for a start, they would describe the actual game being played. They would say something like, we were playing a 6-max online $1, $2 game, so 200 NL. We open raise for 3 big blinds under the gun with ace-king offsuit. The effective stacks are 120 big blinds deep, and our opponent, who is on the button, 3-bets to 10 big blinds. Both blinds fold. We 4-bet to 24 big blinds, and our opponent on the button shoves all in for the remaining 120 big blinds in his stack. Hopefully you can see the difference between those two questions. In that second question, we have much more of the important variables. We have the open raise sizing, the 3-bet sizing, the 4-bet sizing, the effective stacks, the 5-bet sizing. We also have the exact positions of the players involved, and we know exactly which game it is. It's a 6-max game played at 200NL online. Now, this might be fairly straightforward to accomplish if we have a name for a specific line or situation, but there are actually gaps. There are blind spots in what existing poker terminology covers, and it's essentially our job to make sure that we have enough terminology to fairly represent the most common situations that can crop up as part of the game tree. Let's go over some important terminology. You may or may not be familiar with these, but incorporating this terminology into your poker discussions, it's just going to make it more likely that you and whoever you're discussing poker with are going to be envisioning the exact same situation rather than thinking you're talking about the same spot, but you're actually not. More importantly, having access to this terminology is going to upgrade the way that you actually think about the game. So let's start off with the term float, as in float bet. Now, using traditional terminology, a float is a call with the intention of bluffing at the pot on a later street. Now, we're not talking about that right now. We're talking about a float bet. So we want to differentiate between the two. A float is a call with a speculative hand having the intention to bluff on a later street, whereas a float bet is a bet versus missed c-bet while in position. So a common example could be that we're in the big blind and we cold call against a small blind open. The small blind skips his flop c-bet while OOP, and we stab in position. That's called a flop float bet. Similarly, if our opponent does c-bet the flop OOP, we call against the flop c-bet, and our opponent checks the turn, so he skips his turn c-bet, then we can fire the turn in position, and that would be referred to as a turn flop bet. So we can have a float bet on the flop, turn, or river, depending on the action. The term pro bet is fairly similar. It's a bet versus missed c-bet while out of position. So imagine that we are still the big blind cold caller, but this time it's the button that's open raising pre-flop. We cold call against the button open raise. We check to the PFR on the button. He checks back, i.e. he skips his flop c-bet in position. If we fire the turn out of position, that can be referred to as a turn pro bet. If instead our opponent on the button does c-bet the flop, and we check call against the flop c-bet, then the turn goes check check, so our in position opponent skips his turn c-bet in position. If we fire the river out of position in that situation, it can be referred to as a river pro bet. In traditional poker terminology, a pro bet is a small bet designed to gain information regarding the strength of our opponent's range. I would suggest you just discard that traditional definition and reappropriate the term pro bet to mean a bet versus missed c-bet while OOP. The next term is stop and go. This is a phrase which was actually quite well known if you go back 10 years or so, but players started to not use this term. It fell out of popular usage. It's now experiencing a resurgence because it's very useful for describing a bet check bet line. So instead of having to say, hey, you know that situation where we bet the flop, but then we don't fire the turn, but then our opponent checks to us on the river and we fire the river, we can just say, hey, you know stop and go scenario in position, or you know stop and go scenario out of position. So just using a simple phrase, both players are now talking about the same spot. And we can qualify that further, so we can say things like stop and go situation where we are the pre-flop aggressor in position. Because we could also have things like float bet stop and go, for example. So that would be a spot where with a cold caller pre-flop, our opponent skips his flop c-bet, we float bet the flop in position, we don't barrel the turn after float betting the flop, but then our opponent checks to us again on the river, and we can transition into a stop and go line. We might refer to that as a float bet stop and go line to differentiate it from a stop and go line where we are the PFR pre-flop. The next term is one bet. I completely made up this term. Technically, one bet is already existing terminology, but it's never used. It's technically supposed to refer to the first bet in a sequence. So the first raise is referred to as a 2-bet, then the first re-raise is referred to as a 3-bet, etc. But no one uses the term one bet, we would just use the term bet, for example. So I reappropriated this term to describe a situation where the hand gets completely checked down until the river. So flop check check, turn check check, one player bets the river. We can refer to that as a river one bet. Now don't be too surprised if other players don't know this terminology. That's because I made it up, so they may not have heard of it. But this is how important terminology is. If we have a common part of the game tree that's not covered by existing terminology, we should actually just make up some terminology to cover that part of the game tree. So long as those in our poker circle understand the terminology, we can use it to communicate with greater efficiency and once again upgrade the way that we think about the game. Next we have delayed c-bet. So this is a spot where we skip our c-bet, but then we fire on the next street. So for example, we have the opportunity to fire a continuation bet on the flop, but we check the flop. Instead, we fire the turn. This is referred to as a delayed continuation bet. We can extend that further to include other spots. For example, we could have a delayed turn float bet. Now, this might not be exactly as it sounds because it's not actually a turn spot. It's a river spot. Because if we have the opportunity to float bet the turn, which is going to happen on the turn, but we delay that opportunity until the next street and instead fire the river, well, now that term, delayed turn float bet, obviously applies to a river bet in position after we've skipped an opportunity to float bet the turn. Similarly, we sometimes hear players talk about a delayed turn c-bet. That's something that happens on the river as well. We had the opportunity to fire a continuation bet on the turn. We didn't take that, we instead delay it until the river. Having said that, we don't need to use that term because we have a better unequivocal term to describe that situation, which is going to be stop and go. Because if you think about it, we bet the flop, we didn't c-bet the turn, we delayed that to the river. Well, guess what? That's a stop and go scenario. So we can avoid that potentially confusing term delayed turn c-bet, and we just have the stop and go line instead. But this term delayed turn float bet is useful. So it's really just a case of keeping in mind that delayed turn float bet happens on the river, not the turn. Now we're talking a lot about c-bets and we're talking about barrels, but the truth is that we can actually improve that terminology as well. And one of the traps we can fall into is just referring to any bet that's made after a previous bet as a barrel. So for example, we c-bet the flop, then we barrel a turn, then we barrel the river. Or let's just say the flop gets checked through, we fire a delayed c-bet on the turn, and then we barrel the river. Everything just ends up either being a c-bet or a barrel. And the problem is that we could actually be more precise with that terminology. So here's a possible suggestion for how we could use terminology. And this is also going to improve the way that we think about the game. Now, this is not necessarily an accepted convention, so feel free to disregard this. Other poker players may not be using this type of convention, but I tend to try and follow this convention wherever possible when discussing poker. So the first thing is that a barrel is something that happens on the turn. Doesn't happen on the river, doesn't happen on the flop. We might say things like, hey, I 3-bet pre-flop and then barrel the flop. We're not going to do that. A barrel is reserved exclusively for a situation where we fire the turn after betting the flop. Let's think about those situations then where we make our first bet on the turn. So it could be a turn float bet, a turn probe bet, a delayed c-bet. If we fire on the turn and then fire the river, instead of referring to it as a barrel, I will refer to it as a follow-up bet. So anytime I use the term follow-up bet, you automatically know I'm talking about a situation where I've bet the river, and it's specifically a situation where I've bet the river after making my first bet in the hand on the turn. So just by changing one word around, by changing barrel to follow-up, I'm encoding a large amount of extra information into the description of a hand that I'm giving you. Okay, so what about a hand that did fire the flop, then fire the turn, then fire the river? Well, we can just refer to that as a triple. So to put everything into order, we c-bet the flop, we barrel the turn, then we triple the river. So because I've upgraded the terminology there to be more specific, you know exactly what's happened at previous points in the hand. If I talk about tripling the river in a certain spot, you automatically know that I've fired the flop and turn. If If I talk about following up on the river, you automatically know that I didn't fire the flop, and I'm just firing the turn and river. And overusing of the word barrel is very similar to overusing of the phrase continuation bet, because we can also say things like, I continuation bet the flop, then I continuation bet the turn, then I continuation bet the river. So it gets overused like the term barrel, and as a result, it lacks information. So if I'm talking about continuation betting the river, well, you know that I fired the turn, but you don't know whether or not I fired the flop. Because players might say things like, we flop bet the turn, then we fired a continuation bet on the river. So it lacks information, because the term continuation bet doesn't encode what we did on the flop and turn. Whereas the term follow-up bet tells us that we didn't bet the flop, whereas the term triple tells us that we did bet the flop. So not everything needs to be a barrel, not everything needs to be a continuation bet. We can upgrade our terminology here. Let's finish off by talking about some common pitfalls. I feel these are fairly traditional and most of the poker community would agree with these, but falling into one of these traps, first of all, it makes it look like you don't really know what you're talking about, but more importantly, it starts to confuse other players as well, and that again makes it harder to think about the situation correctly. You're not necessarily going to end up on the same page as the person you're discussing poker with if you don't avoid these pitfalls. So make sure you get the following right. These are fairly important. Otherwise, you'll find yourself having a conversation where you and your partner are talking about completely different things. You just don't realize it. So the first is check versus check back. What is the difference between check and check back? Might seem obvious, but it's important. Check back is something that we can only do when we're in position. And it's logical to then only use check to describe a situation where we're out of position and our opponent still gets to act after us. Why say check when we can say check back, which is more descriptive? But it's really important not to say check back if you're out of position. That's probably one of the most misleading things you can do, is because as soon as you say check back, everyone is going to be assuming that you're in position. So if you use the term check back to describe a spot where you check while you're OOP, you're not going to end up on the same page as the other people you're discussing the hand with. In a similar way, let's think about the difference between check raise versus raise. Now, it's true that raise is a very general term. You could use the term raise to describe a raise in position or out of position. But why do that when we can reserve the term raise for raising in position, and if we're raising while OOP, we make sure to specify using the term check raise. So we shouldn't really ever use the term raise to describe a situation where we're check raising. And of course, we should never use the term check raise to describe a situation where we're raising in position and haven't checked on the current street already. Another pitfall can occur when using the terms shove, push, and jam. These are aggressive terms. They should be used for describing a situation where we are the raiser. So we don't want to say things like, our opponent went all in, we thought for a while and decided it was correct to push the rest of our stack, or to shove the rest of our stack, or jam the rest of our stack. We're clearly describing a call in that situation because our opponent took the last aggressive action. We should instead say something like, our opponent shoved all in, we thought about it, we decided to call. If we are the ones that shoved all in, or we are the ones that raised all in, then we can use the term shove, push, or jam because we're the player that took the aggressive action. Finally is the difference between bet, raise, and re-raise. If you are reading tutorials on the rules of poker, or if you are reading books on poker, these terms can sometimes get mixed up because if we're technical about it, a bet is also a raise, and a raise is also a bet. And a re-raise is also a type of raise, and it's also a type of bet. So we could actually find ourselves just using these terms interchangeably in every situation. If we do that, we're missing out on an opportunity to refine our terminology and get it to convey as much information as possible. So here is how this works. A bet should only ever be the first bet in a sequence. Now, in terms of pre-flop open raising in Hold'em, we refer to that as a raise rather than a bet because of the blind investment. So the first bet in the sequence is actually the mandatory big blind payment. So that's why we refer to a raise as an open raise. But let's say we are heads up on the flop no one's taken any action so far, the first wager made on that street should be referred to as a bet, not a raise. Yes, if we bet, it is technically a raise because the existing bet to start the street was 0, and now it's whatever we've raised it to. So yes, it is technically a raise, but we should use the term bet. The first raise against that should be referred to as a raise, definitely not a re-raise. And then the second raise, or the first re-raise in the sequence, should be referred to as a re-raise. So we don't want to describe a re-raise as a raise, when we can describe it as a re-raise, which is more accurate, it conveys more information. Okay, so here is the challenge for you. The next time you are posting a hand in the Red Chip Poker Discord, or you're discussing poker with your poker circle, make your goal to upgrade your terminology, to convey more information more accurately with the way that you describe various poker situations. Feel free to use some of the terminology that's been discussed in this podcast episode as well, to upgrade the way you talk about poker, and as an extension, you'll see that it begins to upgrade the way you think about the game as well, which is definitely the most important. Thanks very much for listening, guys. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.